Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a look at a really critical situation. The potential shifts, maybe even instability, right at the top in China, specifically Xi Jinping.
Yeah, it's definitely a situation with huge global ripples. We're digging into these internal pressures that seem to be, well, building up under the surface.
And guiding us today, we've looked at a recent discussion, some really sharp insights from Mookie Tenenbaum about what might be happening inside China.
That conversation, it offered a perspective that kind of pulls different threads together. It points to vulnerabilities you might not see at first glance.
So our mission here is to unpack those key insights. We want to identify the pressures, the signals of potential weakness, maybe find the turning points shaping China's path, especially its leadership.
Trying to understand what's really going on behind that, carefully controlled state image.
Okay, let's get into it. Xi Jinping, he's been in power for, what, 12, 13 years now? Quite a while.
That's right. And to really grasp the shift under Xi, you've got to understand the system before him. I mean, apart from the Mao era, China usually had a more collegial system. Power was shared.
Like a group decision-making thing at the top.
Exactly. But the source points out, Xi very deliberately took that apart, systematically moved away from that model to consolidate power himself.
And his main tool, early on anyway, this discussion highlights the anti-corruption campaign, looked like cleaning house, but maybe more about rivals.
That campaign was, well, a very convenient pretext. It let him remove potential challengers, all under the banner of fighting corruption.
And we saw some huge names caught up in that. The source mentioned tech leaders like Jack Ma, who kind of vanished for a bit, though interestingly, he did pop up again later.
Yes, and his reappearance along with others is actually flagged as a really significant sign later on. But it wasn't just business. Xi also went after military leaders, heads of the Army, Air Force, the Missile Force, all dismissed. And the source notes this raised questions even back then. Was it just about power, or were there, other issues, maybe with military capability itself?
And then there was that really public moment at the party congress. Xi having Hu Jintao escorted out. The source stresses how big a deal that was, losing face like that in China.
Oh, immense. A huge public humiliation.
Yeah.
And Hu Jintao disappeared after that. But here's the interesting twist. Hu Jintao, despite his age, despite that incident, he's reappeared.
Really?
Yeah. And the source points to this, and others Xi purged coming back, as suggesting a high level of, well, weakness in Xi's position now. It implies he feels he needs these people back, people he pushed aside.
That really does sound like desperation if you read the tea leaves of party politics. Okay, so if those early moves were about grabbing power, what are the pressures now, the signs of weakness?
There are several things hitting at once. Economically, China's facing major headwinds. Yeah. The real estate crisis is massive. You've got this glut of empty apartments. Companies may be cooking the books.
Inflating numbers.
Right. And bankruptcies the government isn't fully rescuing. And remember, for many ordinary Chinese, their savings are literally in bricks and mortar.
So that hits home. Hard.
Directly. It creates real discontent, even if you don't see big protests because of the repression. The source even mentions this idea of maybe drawing the numbers, basically fudging the stats to hit growth targets, suggests things might be worse than they look officially.
Okay, let's switch to the military side. What about readiness, particularly concerning Taiwan?
Well, Xi publicly set that goal, didn't he? Be ready to take Taiwan by 2027, put the army on alert. But obviously, the invasion hasn't happened.
And this source suggests there might actually be doubts within the Chinese military about whether they can pull off an invasion.
Yes, that's a really striking point in the discussion. It's hinted these doubts might be linked to those earlier dismissals of generals. I mean, yeah, they had the world's biggest navy developing fancy planes, but the military is described as maybe somewhat unprepared for something as complex as an amphibious assault.
Lacking real combat experience, too, right?
Yeah. Very little recent experience. Their last major war was, 78 against Vietnam, and they lost. The source also mentions things like problems with arms exports. Those jets sold to Pakistan apparently didn't perform well. More signs of potential capability gaps.
That definitely challenges the official narrative of overwhelming strength. What about the tech race? AI, chips, that sort of thing?
Another major pressure point. China's finding it really hard to get the high-end chips they need for cutting-edge AI, because of U.S. restrictions. Right. And the source suggests this might be leading to some, let's say, questionable claims about scientific breakthroughs, maybe trying to save face when the underlying tech isn't quite there.
So the gap with the U.S. isn't closing. It might even be widening.
That's the view presented, yeah. And that widening gap, it's seen as a ticking clock for China's big ambitions. The longer it takes, the harder it gets.
And then you've got external things like tariffs adding to the economic strain.
Exactly. Those high U.S. tariffs, first under Trump, now doubled on steel and aluminum. It's another blow.
Okay, now, the discussion highlighted one huge Xi Jinping initiative as a particular problem now, almost a liability. The Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
Ah, yes. The BRI. It started as this incredibly ambitious, almost imperial idea, right? Project China's influence globally. Build infrastructure everywhere using China's massive financial reserves, around $3 trillion back then.
Building roads, ports, railways.
All over the world. The idea was to gain influence, maybe even control, through the debt these poor countries took on.
Like the Sri Lanka port example.
Yeah.
Or just getting work for Chinese companies.
Exactly. Either control via debt or lock in work for Chinese firms and project power. But the source describes it basically as a major failure, a fracasso.
How so? Where did it go wrong?
The numbers mentioned are pretty stark. It apparently ate up a huge chunk of China's reserves, maybe a third, with very little financial return. Repayment rates from borrowers, incredibly low, like 20%.
Wow.
And in many cases, China had to lend more money just so countries could pay the interest on the first loans, basically showing good money after bad.
Were the loan terms themselves part of the problem?
Yeah, described as having really high, almost leonine interest rates, made repayment super difficult. And crucially, unlike old colonial powers, China doesn't really have the military clout or maybe the diplomatic muscle to force these countries to pay up.
And how did it go down locally, the Chinese presence in these countries?
The source suggests it often caused friction. They made enemies everywhere is roughly the translation used. You hear about problems in Africa? That Laos train project costing a third of the country's GDP. Huge burden. So the conclusion presented is, it was driven by these grand, pharaonic communist dreams, but lacked practical know-how. Result: unfinished projects, massive financial losses, damaged relationships, not influence and wealth. And because it was Xi's signature project, it's now seen as this huge weight hanging over him, a sort of Damocles, as the source puts it.
Okay, so you pile all that up. The economy struggling, military doubts, the BRI mess, the tech gap. What does the discussion say about the chances of actual leadership change?
Well, the source is very clear on one thing. Any change would come from inside the Communist Party, not from public dissent that's clamped down hard. Think Hong Kong. That crackdown actually initially reinforced Xi's tough image inside the party, showing he could maintain control.
Right, because the party's whole legitimacy is kind of based on that deal with the population, isn't it?
Exactly. The unspoken agreement. We deliver economic progress, better lives, you stay quiet and obey. When the economy falters, that deal is endangered.
And Xi getting rid of term limits, aiming to stay indefinitely, that wasn't universally popular inside the party itself.
No, that's a key internal friction point. It broke the post-Mao norm meant to stop one person getting too powerful. And the source really hammers this point, bringing back purge figures like Jack Ma, like Hu Jintao. That's seen as a clear sign of desperation, a high level of weakness.
So these failures, economy, military, BRI, they become ammunition for potential rivals within the party.
Precisely. The source flat out says Xi has lost allies because of how he consolidated power.
Is there any sense of where a challenge might come from? A specific faction or base?
Shanghai gets mentioned. As China's big commercial financial hub, it's often seen as a potential power base for leaders who might want to challenge the center. And that urgency about the tech gap, the clock is ticking, that's also pushing the elite. They know China has to fix this technological vulnerability.
So, does the source venture a guess on timing? When might things come to a head?
The prediction offered is soon. The upcoming August CCP leadership meeting is floated as a potential time frame. Speculation is maybe Xi gets replaced, or maybe he's forced back into a more collective leadership model to stop anyone getting that powerful again and making these big bets that go wrong. And there's that historical pattern in communist systems, right? A new leader often exposes the mistakes of the old one, unless they were tight allies, since Xi reportedly burned bridges.
They'd be exposed if replaced.
That's the expectation. But the source also stresses the party needs to manage any change very carefully. They can't risk public unrest over the economy or the unfulfilled Taiwan promise, especially if the leadership looks divided.
Makes sense. A messy transition is the last thing they want. Okay, how does the U.S. see all this potential internal weakness in China?
Well, according to the source's analysis, the U.S. has a specific strategic aim right now: get its allies in Europe against Russia, in Asia against China, to spend more on their own defense.
And for allies to open their wallets, they need to feel a real immediate threat, right?
Exactly. The thinking presented is, if China looks weak or inward-looking, that external threat perception drops. Allies might get complacent. Think Japan, South Korea, their spending increases are described as relatively small, living neato.
So the U.S. might actually have an interest in, well, talking up the China threat, even if they know about the internal issues.
That's the argument forward, yeah. To reinflate the Chinese bogeyman is the phrase used to motivate allied spending. That recent statement from the U.S. Defense Secretary about an imminent threat, maybe time for market digestion over a weekend, cited as an example, pushing regional allies to chip in more.
So it's less about predicting an invasion tomorrow, more about maintaining that perception of high risk.
The source suggests that while a full Taiwan invasion would be a global disaster, even smaller aggressive moves by China could be used to keep Asian allies worried enough to boost defense budgets.
Yeah.
And then there are the vested interests mentioned.
Meaning?
U.S. arms manufacturers are specifically named. They benefit hugely from increased global defense spending driven by a perceived strong China threat. If that threat seems smaller, spending might dip.
That adds another complex layer to the rhetoric. Okay, final area. Given all these problems, does the source give a sense of China's overall direction now? Do the leaders have a clear strategy?
The view offered is pretty stark, that basically at this moment, China's leaders have kind of lost their way. Perdieron el rumbo.
They lack a clear path forward.
Seems to be the implication. The BRI failure is used as the prime example. These huge, ambitious dreams, but flawed execution. Didn't understand local contexts, bad loans, couldn't collect the debt.
And ended up losing money and goodwill instead of gaining influence.
Exactly. A massive project driven more by grand vision than a practical, sustainable strategy for engaging with the world. It suggests a lack of clear, long-term direction right now.
Wow. Okay, so this deep dive really highlights a complex web of pressures on Xi Jinping: economic woes, military questions, the huge BRI failure, the tech gap.
Yeah, and while, predicting specifics is impossible, the combination of these things, as laid out in the source, strongly suggests a significant shift inside the CCP could be coming, maybe around that August meeting.
And it leaves you, the listener, with a pretty big thought, doesn't it? If the source is right, if a nation as powerful as China has maybe lost its way and lacks a clear strategy, what does that mean for everyone else? Definitely something to ponder.
It's a superpower, potentially adrift.
Yeah.
The implications are, well, immense.
Yeah.
And unpredictable.
Absolutely. Well, that concludes our deep dive today into the dynamics within China's leadership, drawing on that insightful discussion. Thanks for joining us.